Welcome to the Faculty Forum online broadcast, which allows alumni to interact with MIT faculty experts about their cutting-edge research and timely topics. I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I will be the moderator today. To participate, first, please input a username and your location, then simply type your question at the bottom of your screen. While we'll not be able to cover every question over the next half hour, we will do our best to cover as many as possible, and certainly the main themes. Our speaker today is economics professor Daron Acemoglu, and a link to his bio is on your screen. Welcome, Professor Acemoglu.
Thank you.
To start, I would like to ask you to provide a framework and context for our program by briefly discussing your research into economic growth.
Economic growth based on innovation and technological dynamism is highly consequential for our incomes, employment, our future fiscal outlook, and it's much more important than short-term fixes. Economic growth compounds. It essentially builds on itself. If we are able to return to our pre-recession growth trajectory of about 2% a year growth, we will be about 49% richer in 20 years' time than we are today. If we were able to increase that to 3% a year, we would be about over 80% richer in 20 years' time than we are today. And I think it is actually possible for us to increase our growth trajectory. However, unfortunately, I think at the moment it's much more likely that we'll be facing a growth crisis than this optimistic scenario. I have no doubt about the great innovative potential of the US society, but I think there are clear and present threats to our ability to grow. So let me mention 4 of those that I think are important. I think the first one that most people will have already thought about is that we are in the midst of a recession, and we are not doing much to get out of it. Consumption is low and people are indebted and are not spending. Businesses are afraid that they're not going to be facing enough demand for their products, and they are uncertain about the future, so they're not expanding capacity, they're not hiring workers, and even more importantly, they're cutting back research and development, and they're not engaging in as much innovation as they normally are. So it is absolutely essential that we take comprehensive steps towards ending the root causes of the crisis, including the problems in the on households' balance sheets and in the home ownership aspect of our economy. Second, and in my opinion more importantly, there are political risks against growth. Research and history have taught us that economic growth, as all economic activity, needs to be based on a healthy political infrastructure, inclusive institutions that provide security and voice to all. And historically, the United States has been very successful, has shown great ingenuity in withstanding a lot of challenges, from robber barons to unscrupulous politicians alike. But for the first time in many generations, I think there's a real danger that that infrastructure is collapsing. Mm-hmm. This is not only because of the acrimonious atmosphere in Washington, though that is important. I think it's much more because the polarization in our society has led to a gridlock in every sphere of our political life. And it's perhaps much more because special interests and lobbying have become so much more influential in politics and have led to a variety of bad policies for which we are still paying the price. Third, equally importantly, innovation needs to be based on some sort of rewards for the innovators. The mainstay of that system were patents that ensured that innovators got remunerated for their innovation activity. But patents have now become a litigation tool, and companies are bought and sold not because of business synergies, but as for building a war chest in upcoming patent wars. And I think a true overhaul of the patent system is necessary, not the sort of narrow interest and lobbying inspired small fixes that we've been discussing. And finally, I think innovation obviously needs talent, both for the innovators and for the engineers and the designers who are going to make those dreams come true. And the United States has been very successful in innovation because it's been able to harness great talent, and it's been able to attract great talent from all around the world, and it's been able to attract them to innovative activities within the United States. But over the last 2.5 decades, we've created a reward structure which encourages people not to go into innovative activities, but to go into Wall Street and finance. And I think that's something we have to really rethink.
Well, thank you for that wonderfully concise encapsulation of your thoughts on the, not the economic growth issue, the economic no growth issue. Questions are coming in, but as we gather them, let me begin by asking you a couple of questions of my own. What impacts will the debt problems in Europe and the US have on the West's ability to be a driving force for innovation?
Well, I think this is a very important issue. We are in the midst of an economic malaise, both in Europe and in the United States. And this is obviously holding back all sorts of economic activity and innovation. And I think there are actually major parallels between what's going on in the United States and Europe. In Europe, it's the country indebtedness that's the problem. In the United States, it's household indebtedness that's the problem. And in both cases, we are essentially kicking the can down the road and not taking policy actions. In 2008 and at the latest in early 2009, it should have been obvious that something needed to be done about the indebtedness of US households, low and middle income households with negative equity and that are being hit by foreclosures. And we haven't done anything. We've focused on other things. And now I don't think it's too late yet, but it's getting later and later. And it's the same problem in Europe. And Europe and United States have to show leadership because the innovative core of the world economy is still in Europe and the United States.
I'm going to go off script a little and ask a follow-up question. What are the policy actions that you think would directly address both the household indebtedness in the US and the governmental indebtedness in Europe? Are there recommendations you would have?
Well, I think the details need to be worked out, and it's hard to say anything formulaic, but it's clear that some sort of radical restructuring of debts is necessary. It's the same for Greece. You know, we are all in the midst of, you know, a discussion about pennies, but really the big problem is, you know, the Greece cannot survive, and together with Greece, European economies are going to have a hard time surviving if fiscal sanity is not brought, and that's not going to happen unless there is a 60%, 70% write down on Greek debt. The same thing is true for US households. Why should a thing that's true for Greece should not be true for US households? There are all very, very highly indebted. You know, the low-income US households have much more debt than they've ever had. And as long as that continues, they're going to have problems with their meeting their mortgage obligations. Their foreclosures are going to balloon, and there's going to be more downward pressure on house prices, and they're not going to consume. And if they don't consume, that's going to put pressure on the economy. So I think restructuring debt, you know, not worrying so much about what the mortgage holders are going to think about it, is something that should have been done earlier and was still not too late.
They already got their bailout. I see that we have some questions coming in. Here's one from L. Duke in Philadelphia. Is innovation enough to stimulate demand? Can you give examples of when innovation was able to activate economic recovery from a deep recession?
That's an excellent question. I think innovation by itself is not enough to get us out of the recession. Innovation is the best tool we have for long-run growth. But we also need to get out of the recession, and that's why I put the problems that we are facing with recession not as a simple consequence of lack of innovation. In fact, we have great innovative capacity in the economy, and people are coming up with new ideas even in the depth of the recession. But innovation by itself is not going to be able to get us out of it. And that's even more true today, because many of the new machines that we are inventing and new business organizations that we are developing are labor-saving in nature. They are replacing many tasks that were previously performed by workers. That's great in the long run for job creation, because as businesses become more profitable and productivity increases, other sectors are going to start hiring workers. But we cannot just rely on great ideas suddenly to be the engine of job creation. More needs to be done, and fixing the demand side of the economy, the lack of consumption and indebtedness are among those.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here from Candace Gibson in London, Ontario. Are we doing the right things in our education programs to train people to be innovative and also to think about moving new findings and discoveries into products?
That's another great question. I think it's generally agreed that the US education system has serious problems. And I think there is much to be fixed, especially in K through 12 education, where low quality is becoming a real problem as we are trying to compete internationally in manufacturing and other sectors. However, I don't know personally what would be a silver bullet for making our youth more innovative. I think many of the alternative education systems that have been tried around the world have led to good results in terms of performance in tests and so on, but I think they haven't been tested on innovativeness and on thinking big. It might well be that there is a lot for us to learn from what's going on in East Asia in terms of education, a much more kind of disciplined education system, but it may well be that that's not the solution to sort of our innovation kind of dilemma, so to speak.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I'm going to take the opportunity for a brief infomercial moment, because the Alumni Association does have an alumni interest group in K through 12 education. And any of you out there who are watching and are interested in that particular topic can sign up to be a part of that group at the Infinite Connection website. So just know that you can help. How can green technology spur innovation, and what could MIT do to move this forward?
Another fantastic question. So I'm actually a great green technology optimist. Not for job creation reasons. I think there is sometimes a misplaced emphasis on green technology creating jobs. That's not going to happen for the same reasons as I mentioned in the previous answer. You know, a lot of the innovations that we're talking about are on the physical capital side. They're not going to create many jobs for people to right away. But green technology is important for several reasons. First of all, I think any thinking person has to be worried about the climate change, and we have to cut carbon emissions. So green technology is crucial for that. But I think it's much more than that. I think green technology has the same potential as computer technology in that it's a platform on which many other sectors are going to depend on. And it's a platform where hardware and software innovations will meet. So it's a particularly fruitful area for us to invest in, because it's going to become important in and of itself and for the rest of the economy. And I think MIT has to be at the forefront of all of these things. MIT has been at the forefront of all sorts of information technology innovations and biotech innovations, nanotechnology innovations. And similarly, there's a lot of interesting research going on, both in alternative energy and nuclear power, within MIT, and our graduates are at the forefront of this. But I think it's not just MIT's job. I think it's the government's job as well. Green technology is different from others, that it actually needs a sort of a carbon pricing so that innovators receive not only compensation for what they do, but compensation for reducing carbon emissions, and also more support for green energy companies, despite all of the scandals that have sort of set back the agenda.
Sort of additional incentives that are provided by the government.
Yeah, I think
besides just the economic or business incentives.
Well, no, it's part of the economic incentives. You can think of it, but I wanted to distinguish between. I think there are two things that the government needs to do. One is to set a price for carbon. You know, we are essentially subsidizing carbon usage in this country, and that's not a good thing for the future generations, and it's not a good thing for green technology. But just setting a carbon tax is not enough. I think in addition, the government, through loan guarantees for such things as nuclear plants or research support for people who are trying to find innovative solutions to our energy problems, be it in generating energy through solar, wind, and other channels, or distributing energy through a smart grid. So those kind of subsidies are also quite important and are things that other governments are doing, and the United States is falling behind.
Okay. So moving along, New York Mayor Bloomberg apparently wants to replicate the success of the Kendall Square development, where MIT has attracted the world's top bioengineering firms to the area. He's working to get a major university to set up a high-tech grad school in the city. Stanford, Cornell, and other universities are said to be interested. Do you see this as a useful model for promoting regional growth?
Yes, absolutely. Regional growth or innovation clusters such as Kendall Square, Route 128, Silicon Valley have been very successful, and there is a good reason for that. You know, they are engaged in complementary activities. Their workforces are shared, meaning that a scientist or an engineer or a worker works in one company and then goes to another company, takes ideas, creates synergies, and it just creates an environment full of technological dynamism. And I think it's a great thing that more of this is tried. But I must say that just clusters is not enough, meaning that technology, innovation, and sort of economic dynamism have to be in every part of our geography and society, and just relying on a few clusters is not the solution for the United States, but it's a great thing that more of this is being done. H.J.
Klein from Irvine, California asks, to what extent is the regulatory regime in the U.S. stifling economic growth? What type of regulatory reform, if any, would you recommend?
Great question. I think I have to say I don't know. It is clear that regulatory burden has increased somewhat, but exactly how much and what it's doing to innovation have not been systematically studied. It is clear to me that sort of the patent side, which you can think of it as a bureaucratization of patents, as I mentioned, is having a negative effect. And you will hear stories from entrepreneurs about how the fear of not being able to fire workers and all the paperwork and the red tape they have to go through in order to start up is becoming a real barrier. On the other hand, it is important that there is a broad and sort of intelligent regulatory system within the U.S. economy, and we've seen that lack of that in the financial sector has been costly. Lack of that in auditing was costly when we had the Enron scandals, and we also need some regulatory system for consumer safety and so on. But it is a very difficult balance because often these things can become excessive and really stifle growth.
So moving along, Mark Hockman in the office asks, there are many political statements blaming government-inspired so-called business uncertainty for current slow growth rates. Have you seen real data supporting this contention? If so, what are the specific topics for precipitating that uncertainty?
No, I haven't seen real data. It's the sort of thing that it's very difficult because there are multitude of causes for what's going on at the moment. But what we know is that companies are sitting on cash. It's not that many of the large companies are constrained and can't invest. They're just choosing not to invest. And I think that has to have one of two reasons. Either we're really pessimistic about the future, because it's not because of lack of ideas, lack of innovation, lack of new technologies, either because they are really pessimistic about consumer demand, or they're afraid about some sort of uncertainty. So I think the consumer demand is more important, but I wouldn't rule out the uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future as a potential contributing factor. You know, we have a huge deficit, and somebody has to do something about it. And if there is uncertainty about whether that's going to mean an increase in corporate taxes or increase in regulation or total dismantling of certain welfare programs, that's going to create uncertainty for businesses as well as households.
Thank you. Doug in Connecticut asks, what is the impact on growth from the size of government? Japan and Germany grew faster than the US in the post-war era, but their growth slowed in the 70s for Germany and in the 90s for Japan, as the government's share of the economy increased. Recently, the US has seen a large increase in the share taken by government, and we now have slow growth. Economic studies of this question appear to be ambiguous.
Yes, absolutely. Economic studies are ambiguous. I think there is little doubt that if you tax more at the margin, that's going to discourage people. It's going to especially discourage entrepreneurs. But the size of the government is not the same as marginal taxes. First of all, we can for the same size of government, we can have more efficient taxes. Right now in the United States, as much as the problem being the size of the government, is our very insanely inefficient tax system. So that's a more important problem to tackle than the size of the government, though I think the size of the government is creating fairly serious problems too, because it is raising the possibility of, are we on an unsustainable path? So it is actually quite important to note that there were proposals on the table from, about fixing both the tax system and putting a lid on the expansion of the government sector, but they died quickly because of our dysfunctional political situation at the moment.
You have proposed that encouraging skilled foreign workers to work and settle in the U.S. would foster innovation. What's the problem with our current way of handling this with the H-1B visas?
Well, I think the main problem is that we're just not letting enough of them in. I mean, it's just pure and simple.
Yeah.
Millions of people want to come to the United States. They want to come to the United States because they have something to contribute. They're not, coming here. They don't want to come here to be cleaners or gardeners. They want to come here to work in Silicon Valley, to work in research, in engineering, and they have the skills. And it's not as if they are robbing those skills away from their country, because many of these who come back here, then they go back, they bring those ideas, they take those ideas back. So we are the winner, and their countries are the winner, and these people are the winner. But we have an irrational system that just discourages the most skilled people who have most to bring to the United States from coming here.
What government steps are needed to boost the commercialization of innovation? You have mentioned that the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980 was a small advance. What should be next?
I think there is a delicate balance, which is that you want academia and research in general to be open. The great innovation of the patent system when it was first introduced was that it remunerated innovators, but at the same time it made that information public and generally open so that other people could build on it. So our academic system has managed to create an open environment in which people can build on each other's ideas, but it hasn't created a natural platform for these ideas to be commercialized. And the Bayh-Dole Act was a small step because it lifted a particular regulatory barrier for academics to use federally funded research as a stepping stone for commercialization. But I think we need to create a much more comprehensive bridge from academic research to actually implementing these ideas in time.
Emil Friedman in Danbury, Connecticut asks, selling you a computer does not create wealth. It just transfers the wealth from me to you and the medium of exchange from you to me. Producing a computer from raw materials creates wealth. Assembling it only creates a little bit of wealth if I have to buy the components. Building a house or making major improvements to a house creates wealth. Selling a house as is just transfers it. This suggests that the manufacturing sector is crucial. Questions. Can we recapture the manufacturing sector from China? Can we somehow export the labor movement to China so that, one, their workers will have a better life, and two, they won't undercut our labor market?
Lots of issues that are being raised here. So I think, let me answer some parts of this question, which is quite wide-ranging. The first one is that I agree manufacturing is very important, But there is a lot of value creation in the United States, even when assembly and putting things together is being done in other parts of the world. So take iPhones or iPads or iPods. They are being assembled in China. But a large part of the value added when you actually buy an iPod goes to Apple, which has made the design and the construction of the product in the first place. Another part of the value added goes to Taiwan or South Korea, where some of the high-tech components have been manufactured. So it's a real global value chain. But the fact that the assembly is being done in China, it's actually creating value for the United States because it's keeping the prices of iPods and iPhones low. However, it is important that we don't totally relinquish manufacturing to other countries for several reasons. First, manufacturing has been a mainstay of an equitable distribution of income in the United States. So what has happened is that as manufacturing has migrated from the United States and as some of the tasks that were previously performed by workers has been taken over by machines and computers, we have hollowed out the income distribution. We've created a polarization where there are a lot of low-paid people, there are a lot of very, very highly paid people, but that middle class is sort of missing. So I think that's one of the reasons why manufacturing is important. But it is also a very dynamic and innovative sector of the economy, and there is a real danger that if manufacturing totally leaves the United States, there might be even more roadblocks against creating the next iPhone or the next Android-based system, because they are very complementary to the manufacturing ideas. So I think we should be we should be careful about what's going on in manufacturing. And I think it would be, frankly, great if Chinese workers were paid more so that their life standards increased and they became even a greater force towards democratization in China. But of course, we have to take what's going on in the rest of the world as given, and we have to think about how we can direct innovation more to areas which are going to be greater force towards job creation in manufacturing and other sectors.
Returning to an earlier topic you were talking about, you talked a little bit about the patent system. And we have someone asking, what changes do you propose to the patent system to encourage economic growth?
I think there isn't a one-line answer to this, but a couple of issues that need to be emphasized. First of all, I think patents and copyright are creating kind of substitute systems of protection for such things as music, art, and software. So that needs to be rationalized, and it needs to be rationalized in such a way that software patents don't become a barrier to future innovation. So right now, any software company has to be extremely afraid that part of what they're doing was patented by somebody else, and that's one of the reasons why there are all these patent trolls and that you have to kind of navigate through. A second important thing is that it has to be this sort of separation of patents from the innovation and from the companies that are sort of using it for making products as a kind of a litigation tool has to be stopped, because that's not an efficient way of rewarding people who have made the innovation, because people have to sell their patent for a very cheap price with the hope that in the future you can actually sue somebody in a sort of arbitrary way. And there, patents have to be protecting the people who are doing the innovation and who are doing the manufacturing of that innovation, which is how the whole thing was designed and visualized in the first instance. The patent office needs to be rationalized so that there is a better sort of understanding of what is it that the patents are protecting, and a faster turnaround of patent applications.
Unfortunately, this has to be our last question, but it is, what advice would you give a student trying to decide between a high-salary financial career and a potentially less lucrative career in research or engineering?
Well, I mean, that's the problem. how could I tell, if it's a son or daughter of a friend of mine? No, you should, halve your salary and don't take that high salary. The problem is that we have to deal with this reward structure. We cannot rely on the selflessness of the people so that they do the right occupational choices. The society has to give them the right reward and the right financial and other incentives. Now, one thing I can say is that you have to also worry about what the environment you're getting into. And I think in general, innovation and engineering type activities, and I count research in that and academic research in that, because we are actually building something, are more satisfactory. You see what you're building. It's a much less cutthroat environment, although competition is good in academia and in Silicon Valley and in Kendall Square and Route 128, but it's not a sort of it's a different sort of environment, and I think that has to be valued by people, and it has to be emphasized that that is something valuable. But at the end of the day, society has to fix its reward structure.
As a parent of an artist, I'm going to take a stab at that question as well.
Please.
Because my advice to students is always, the secret to life is figuring out what you love doing more than anything else, and then figuring out how to get someone to pay you to do it.
Okay.
Because if you're doing what you love and you're not making a lot of money, you're still happy. And if you're doing something you hate and you're getting paid all the money in the world, you're still miserable.
I agree fully, and I think that's the life of an academic.
Indeed, indeed. Unfortunately, we have to close now. On behalf of the MIT Alumni Association, I would like to thank Professor Acemoglu for offering his insight, and to our viewing audience for joining us in this interactive session. We encourage you to continue the discussion on economic growth, or no growth as it may be, on our blog, Slice of MIT, following the link that will appear on your screen momentarily, if it's not already there. Anyone who registered for this webcast will also receive a link to a short survey. Please take a moment to fill that out. Your feedback is really important to us, and it will help us to expand this format of programming. Thank you for watching. Our intent is to hold these programs 8 times a year at the end of the month, and I hope you will join us for another Faculty Forum online webcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.